Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into one of the most fascinating, mysterious, and potentially consequential archaeological discoveries in archaeological history. Specimens that may have been created by extraterrestrials. So we'll get into that in a moment. It's a fascinating tale and prospects in which I'm personally and Ubiquity University institutionally are involved. Before we dive into that domain, however, I want to just note on the second day of Passover that we've now crossed the 200th day since October 7th. And what we are witnessing in both Israel and in demonstrations now that are beginning to sweep campuses across the United States and internationally is brought us to an extraordinary moment. It's worth just reminding ourselves of the level of carnage as the Israelis have been seeking to commit the extermination of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Virtually every milestone indicating barbarism and war has been exceeded dramatically by the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. The most egregious one, of course, is the percentage of civilians to military personnel. You have nearly 35,000 civilians killed and tens of thousands more, 75, 80,000 wounded that we know about, against maybe 200 or 300 Hamas fighters. At least those are young men killed that Israel asserted to be working with Hamas, but has not produced any evidence or proof. We've seen the most women and children by percentage as opposed to men killed in this war of any war in modern history. We've seen more children killed as a percentage as contracted to women and men of any war in modern history. We've seen more destruction of infrastructure and culture of any war, certainly in modern history, as a narrow little strip of land, 5 miles wide and between 20 and 25 miles long, depending, has been blown to smithereens with bombing levels in excess of anything that was done even at the height of the Second World War. We've seen the use of artificial intelligence to track down through satellite photography where women and children are hiding and then they're blown to smithereens. Over the last couple of days, we've seen evidence of mass graves as the Israelis, when they assaulted Al-Shifa Hospital and Al-Nasser Hospital, butchered everyone that they found and then just dumped them into mass graves. One mass grave had nearly 300 people in it, almost all women and children. The National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir, today, as he's celebrating Passover and liberation of the Jewish people from servitude and oppression in Egypt, made the suggestion in the news that because of the overcrowding of Palestinian prisoners, they've been kept in deplorable, what even the Israeli media is calling intolerable crowding. His solution is just to begin executing the prisoners that they can't fit into the crowded, where they're packed in, naked, abused, starved, and deprived of water. And his solution on this second day of Passover is just to begin to execute them without trial, without charges, just because they're Palestinians. The level of cultural extermination is now virtually complete. The mosques, the schools, the ancient archaeological sites, cemeteries, wells, trees, olive trees, vegetable gardens, obliterated. And now Netanyahu's announcing that they're going to go into Rafah. And what is surfacing, which is very important for all of us to take in, is that apparently there was a deal cut between the United States and Israel. The right wing in Israel and the right wing in the United States have been conspiring together for many, many decades, actually, to eliminate the Palestinians. They've been wanting to attack Iran. President Biden has been more reluctant. And apparently they cut a deal that in exchange for Israel not destroying massive amounts of Iran and triggering a regional war that could conceivably generate world war, because Russia and China and most of the global South are now backing Iran. The Americans agreed that if the Israelis would just do a little strike, that they would block the Palestinian membership in the Security Council, which I talked about yesterday, stating categorically that the United States would never, ever allow Palestine to become a full member of the United Nations until it had the full approval of the Israeli government and the completion of all negotiations pertaining to peace in the region. And today we find out that the US also agreed with the final destruction of Rafah. So that's what we're about ready to see, is the destruction of Rafah. 1.5 million Palestinians are crowded into essentially a little village in southern Gaza. At the same time, there's been an explosion of protest, starting at Columbia University, spreading to New York University and Yale University and Harvard University and University of California campuses in the West Coast, various other universities, not only in the United States, but now internationally, are starting to catch fire as they're beginning to occupy. And I just want to say a word about this as someone who has fairly deep experience in doing this, having been arrested probably a half a dozen times for occupations at nuclear power sites, occupations at the Pentagon, and so forth, at Harvard, taking over the administration building at Harvard. I want to make 2 points. It's very important as you watch the news. These students are not anti-Semitic. They don't hate the Jews. They're condemning genocide. They're calling for a ceasefire. They're demanding statehood, sovereignty for the Palestinian people that the Jews themselves enjoy in Israel. What's good enough for one people is good enough for all people. And they've been extraordinarily nonviolent. But what you see in the news, and this is very important for us all to take in, they're being called anti-Semitic. They're being called violent. They're being expelled. Massive arrests have been taking place at Yale and so forth as the authorities, under the pressure of AIPAC and the other major Jewish organizations and major donors, are insisting that any dissent be eliminated. And this reminds me of the Vietnam War, when young men like myself refused to fight and took to the streets and burned our draft cards and marched and demonstrated. We were called communists. My father, in fact, who was an ardent supporter of the war, threw me out of the house and disowned me as his son. And what the police did then is what they're doing now. They send in agent provocateurs to incite violence and then blame it on the protesters. That's what the Trump administration did after George Floyd, with all the Black Lives Matter. Agent provocateurs sent in to incite violence. Then you blame it on the protesters. Then you send in the police and arrest everybody. So as the great denouement of whether the world is going to tolerate genocide in Gaza live on TV by Israel and the United States, by Netanyahu and Joe Biden, the students are rising up like they did against the Vietnam War. And the administration is using the same tactics against them today as Nixon did back in the 70s. And I want to encourage every single one of you, if you can find any kind of demonstration, I'm looking for, I've been most of the Palestinian demonstrations here in Washington, D.C. It's time to take a stand. And it's time to stand with Palestine and the cessation of violence. We're in another Occupy moment. We're in another Arab Spring. We're in another 1968, where students all over the world protested. So I want to demarcate this second day of Passover and the rising up of the students around our campuses and celebrate the revolutionary fervor of our young. And in most cases, they're being led by young Jews who, like many Jews around the world, understand the reality of what's going on and the stain that genocide will cause on the house of Israel. So this is not anti-Semitism in action. This is the best of Judaism in action. And this is not a violent conflict. This is an appeal for the cessation of violence. So I just want to register deep solidarity and deep support at this crucial moment where the machinery of genocide, but also the passion of the human spirit will interact. And I'll conclude by saying, as they look back on what caused the end of the Vietnam War, it was not only that the United States was defeated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. That was true. But what sapped the will of the United States to continue its carnage was the massive level of protests, including in the homes of the high US officials that were conducting the war. Their own children turned against them. Let us pray fervently that moment, that moral clarity will rise again in America. So thank you, everyone, for bearing witness as every day we look at genocide in the eye. Every day, we cannot look away. I'd like to now turn our attention to our subject for today. A lot of times these transitions are challenging, but that's the agility of the human psyche and the human being. One of the most fascinating discoveries in archaeology is the Nazca bodies in a cave, several caves actually, in Peru, of specimens between 12 and 1800 years old that were desiccated because of the dryness of the earth and have been a source of deep fascination to scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists and geneticists, biologists, since they emerged in 2015, 2016. And we're very fortunate today to have with us a gentleman, Will Gallison, who's had a very deep passion and exploration of these beings. You may have noted that Michael Mazzola was going to be our speaker today. He had to cancel at the last moment. We'll have him back. But I called Will, and who I had met at the demonstration that we had on the streets of Manhattan about a month and a half ago in New York. And he said that he'd had all this experience with the Nazca bodies. So we had a very animated conversation. We've been staying in touch. He's a musician. He's also an investigative journalist and reporter. So Will is going to now just tell us his story and whatever you want to tell us about your background, Will, and he'll even show us a 3D replica of one of the bodies and maybe some photos. But Will, thank you for coming in at the last moment. And just why don't we start by you just telling your story and your pathway to Nazca.
Okay, hi there. Thank you for what you said about Gaza. As a Jew, I'm in accordance with you. Well, I've been interested in UFOs since I was a teenager. Well, have I lost you?
No, Jim just turned off his video.
No, I just turned off my video so people can just focus on you.
Oh, okay.
Come back as soon as you're done.
Yeah. Okay, now I can see. Yeah, I've been interested since I was a young man. I had various forms of experience as a young child and as a teenager, which I don't have to go into here, but it certainly piqued my interest in the subject in general. I became interested in this case when I saw the videos of Thierry Jamin at the very beginning of the case when he received the bodies from the tomb robber who's known as Mario. He actually received them at first from a fellow named Paul Ranceros, who was an intermediary. Basically, he brought these to Thierry's office in Cusco, Peru, and said, what can you tell me about these? We found them and we don't know what they are. I just happened to see that video and was fascinated. And over the next few weeks, Thierry would show more and more specimens that he had received from this person. And they became more and more outrageous. The first ones were skulls. I don't know if you can see. This is a 3D model, missing its arm, unfortunately, which shows, which was made directly from the CT scan data. So what you see here is not a representation or an artistic representation. It's the actual data from the CT scan that was then rendered by a 3D printer. So it was one of these several of these skulls that were first shown, and some other things. And then he brought out some giant hands, 12, 16 inches long, and eventually some of these full little bodies. And then the ultimate surprise was the body that is known as Maria, which was humanoid and much more humanoid than these, basically looking like a human being with minor variations, the most significant being that it had 3 fingers and 3 toes, as do these little mummies. You can see there's the foot, there's the hand. And that's why this case is called the case of the tridactyl mummies, because for whatever reason, all of the mummies, and there have been at least 5 species represented in these findings, all of them have 3 fingers and 3 toes. And apart from that fact, they are wildly different. Some are certainly mammalian and some are reptilian, for example. Some are something that we can't really, there's a new species which has been found which doesn't look like a reptile or a mammal. So very mysterious. So I spoke to, so I called Thierry. That's the kind of person I am. And I just introduced myself, and he speaks Spanish and French, but not English. So I did my best. I speak some limited French and Spanish, and we communicated. And by a strange coincidence, I was in France doing some recordings because I'm a musician in a little town in the middle of France that happened to be very near where he was giving a lecture. So I stopped by and met Thierry and ended up talking all night with him, and came away 100% convinced that there was something very significant going on here. And I was hooked. I wanted to find out more. Then in 2000, I kept in touch with Thierry, and in 2019, I believe it was, or maybe 2018, there was a conference in Lima, Peru, in front of the Senate, the Peruvian Senate. Unfortunately, not many senators showed up, but there was a lot of press, and Jaime Maussan was there, and a lot of doctors that had been involved with the original investigations. These included radiologists and other biologists, some archaeologists, and they gave very compelling testimony about the reality of these things. I noted that the people who had actually seen them and worked on them were all very convinced that there was something significant. I couch the term there because I don't want to say real or fake or authentic, because those words are a little bit loaded, and what we're dealing with here might be something a little more subtle. Jim, are you there? Can I hear you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I just want to make sure because I'm getting no response, so I don't know if I'm talking to myself or okay. There's no way I could see you. Is there by any chance?
Yeah, I'm coming on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. It's just much easier for me to talk to somebody than a blank screen. Um, when I was invited to go to that conference, I called Robert Salas. Now, I had met Robert uh, at that groundbreaking meeting. I think it was in 2013 at the press club. Maybe you were there, Jim. Everybody was there. It was the what they called a mock Senate hearing at the press club in Washington, D.C. And that was an incredible experience. I met so many people that I admired and that I had been following for years. And one of them was Robert Salas, and we just hit it off. So I called him. I said, "Hey, I'm going down to Peru. Would you like to come with me?" Um, and he said, "No, not really."
We'll maybe say a word about who Robert Salas is,
Yeah,
because he's
pardon me,
very well known.
Yes, he is. Forgive me. Robert Salas is the former Air Force missile launch commander who in 1967 was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. And he was present actually in the underground command capsule in a nuclear missile base when a UFO loomed above the base. And as his guards were watching this thing in terror, all 10 of his Minuteman missiles became inactive. They were deactivated within seconds. 10 missiles which were independently powered, independently controlled. They had no physical connection with each other. It's not like the whole system went down. They all went down, boom, 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 like that. So it's not difficult to draw a conclusion that the UFO was shutting them down. And he wasn't the only one, of course. There were many other cases that came to light after that of the same phenomenon. And that's a very important thing. So Robert has been very brave and very diligent in getting his story out as soon as he realized that he was no longer under a confidentiality commitment, he came forward. And he's been a very active person and in the movement, disclosure movement. In fact, just as an aside, Robert told me that he was interviewed by Arrow at length and recorded the interview with Arrow. And now Arrow is saying that they didn't get any compelling evidence from any of the witnesses, and it seems right there that falsifies their story. Anyway, Robert flew from California, me from New York, and we met in Lima. We attended this hearing, and then we went down to Cusco to look at some of these mummies, which was a thrill. It was a thrill to be in Cusco in the first place, but they were being kept at a secret location. It was very spy novel. We took a cab, Jerry and Robert and me and some other people, and we had the cab leave us about a half a mile away from where we were going so that they wouldn't report to where we went. We walked through the slums of Cusco and to a nondescript little building, and we walked up the stairs, and there was a little laboratory there. We put on gear, sterilized gear, and we opened these boxes, and it was just one after the other. And I'm not an expert in this by any means, and neither is Robert, but we came away feeling these were not fakes. I mean, that was our impression. Again, that means very little because we're not in a position. It's really the scientists and the experts who can make pronouncements about that. But it was very impressive and very moving. And especially the Maria mummy was just sitting there in a cardboard crate. This incredible creature that, who can explain? So after that, I kept in touch with Terry, and I've been following the developments over the years. I went down there again last June with a paleontologist, Clifford Miles, who he's mostly works with dinosaur bones. He's a collector of bones, but he's also a discoverer of bones. But he also assembles skeletons for museums and things like that. He knows his bones. And he wanted to see these things for himself, so he went down there, and I went down there to help translate and just help facilitate the communication. That was fantastic. We looked at the mummies. Between the first visit and this time, many of the mummies had been moved down to the University of Ica, which is part of Nazca, which is a city in Nazca. And that's where they had been held, the original batch, many of them. But some of them had been not brought down there, and they were available to Thierry. I want to stress at this point that Thierry Jamin is often overlooked in the discussions of this case. And Thierry is really central to it. And to some degree, his position has been understated, I think. He was the one who first received the mummies from the tomb robber. He was the one who engaged the scientists, the radiologists and the bone doctors and the local experts down there. And then I don't want to get into contention here, but there, at one point, Gaia and Jaime Maussan understandably wanted to get involved with this case. And they had funding and they had lots of money behind them. And Thierry was eager to get this case as much attention as it could get. Unfortunately, it's my perception that at some point Jaime and Gaia felt that they, because they had the money, had the right to kind of commandeer the narrative. And to some degree, I think Thierry was shortchanged in that regard. But I don't want to go into those politics. It was unfortunate that Thierry has been a little bit left out of the story. Thierry, by the way, has a documentary on Vimeo, which is called Tridactyl, I think it's called Tridactyls, and it's fantastic. It will tell you the story better than I could ever do. And he documented meticulously from the very first day he opened the packages. You could see him opening in his home the packages that he got from Mario and taking them out and being astonished, right through the tests by scientists all around the world.
Now, Will, before we go on, let me just back up a little bit to Mario, and who you referred to as the grave robber. Tell us what you know about Mario and where he found them and the conditions around which the discovery was made, because it's a lot like Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls back in 1945, where just by happenstance, people uncover these extraordinary archaeological findings.
Yes. I have never met Mario. I've come close a few times. I just got there after he had left Cusco, etc. I would like to meet him. But I have had a long conversation with Thierry's colleague, whose name is Jose Casafranca. And Jose is a fascinating man. He was an anti-terrorist policeman, or I guess you'd call it police, fighting the Shining Path in the south of Peru for many, many years. He's got bullet holes all over his body, and he's a tough guy. And he's sort of Thierry's security guy, but he's also very brilliant. And he's Thierry's liaison with Mario. Thierry has met Mario on many occasions, but Jose, being a law enforcement, and there's, as most people know, there's a certain rapport between criminals and cops. They're sort of on both sides of the same coin. And I said to, just in this last visit, I was there in February, and I asked Jose, I said, listen, this whole case comes down to the origin of these beings, of these bodies. Either Mario found them in a cave like he said he did, because nobody outside of Mario's very close circle has actually been to the cave. And that's a very important point. Mario has at times gotten a little money as a side hustle by taking people to places where he claimed there was the cave, but it turned out not to be the cave. It was something much less dramatic. But he's never taken anyone outside of his own small circle. And I assume he has a circle because just to even carry those mummies through the desert, I imagine takes a few people and to, uncover it. But and he said that he had people with him when he made the discovery. So I said to Jose, either he found them in the cave or there's somebody making these in a little factory somewhere in Nazca and giving them to Mario to lie about and to sell, presumably, or somehow benefit somebody. Of course, as I'll get into, there's a lot of evidence that that's not the case. But I said to Jose, "Are you sure that Mario is telling the truth about the cave?" And Jose just looked me straight in the eye. Said, "Well, I've been a cop for 35 years. I've interrogated people up and down, and he's telling me the truth. That was his conclusion, and he has no question whatsoever that Mario, as far as that goes. Now, if Mario found them in a cave, they are not fake. Okay, they may or may not be real remains, unaltered remains of ancient beings, but they're not something that was put together to sell to tourists like a fake pre-Columbian pot, right? And again, as I'll get into, there's a thousand reasons why that's incredibly unlikely or impossible, that scenario. So regarding the mummies, there's three, I think, explanations for why they exist. One is the outright fakery, modern fakes. The other is that they're authentic remains of once living creatures. And the third one is that they are constructions put together by people 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. As you mentioned, the small bodies, these guys, have been carbon dated by many. This is one thing that's not at all contested. They've been dated at somewhere around 850 to 1,000 years old. Maria, and now more bodies that I don't know if the new bodies found by Masson have been, that were revealed by Masson have been dated, but we know that
I've heard 12 to 1,800 years old.
Well, I think that would refer to the fact that these are that the new large bodies are saying are 12 to 1,800.
That's what I've been told, but I don't know. I haven't been
Yeah,
there.
Maria was dated pretty uncontested.
When you were, just for the audience, when you refer to Maria, tell us about Maria.
Thank you. I'm jumping ahead. Maria is I mentioned when I saw the bodies, there were several of these. What I saw when I went with Robert were several of these small ones, maybe 6 of them. A bunch of skulls, clearly from the same species, if you will, and also these enormous hands, something like 16 inches long, 12 to 16 inches long, and various other specimens that some of them looked ridiculously homemade and not in the same class. It was very mysterious. There was a real hodgepodge of some that looked like they couldn't possibly function. Their legs were one long bone or something like that. And the other ones that right up to Maria, who was humanoid. She would be 5'7" if she was, standing up straight. And she has various, and looks basically like a human. Some of the differences are she has no ears and clearly no trace of any external ear that was removed. There's no separation or gash in the skin where the ears would have been removed. She has no hair follicles, so clearly never had any hair. And this can all be shown through microscopy and other tests. Of course, she has 3 fingers and 3 toes, and the 3 fingers that she has are no thumb, by the way, just 3 fingers, as if you had the 3 central fingers. They have an extra digit. So some people originally were saying that these hands were just normal human hands, that they lopped off the pinky and the thumb. Well, that would be very easy to detect because the bones that attach to those fingers would be present, and they're not. Likewise, the toes. But also, there's an actual extra joint where we have 1, 2, 3, and then 4 phalanges in our hands. Maria has 5. And at the end of that, what they call the distal phalange, the last digit in the finger, there are fingerprints, but they're not human fingerprints. They are they're sort of parallel lines. Very, very strange. And I cannot imagine, and no one who's actually looked at them. It's easy to speculate if you're in an armchair, thousands of miles away, but the people who've actually examined them, and I'm talking about scientists and biologists, they say these are unaltered hands. And so we'll get into what these things might be. But anyway, what I would getting back.
Just to underscore that point for a moment, Will, because I think you've just made a very seminal point, which I've heard from Michael Mazzola and the various people that he's taken down, is that the one thing that people of scientific note have said is that they appear to be authentic and unaltered. Whatever they were then, whatever they are now, there's no evidence of tampering or manipulation in any way. So what we've found is what was left in that cave, 1,000, 1,500 years ago, or whatever the dating is. But go ahead.
Just speaking of the dating, just so I don't forget to mention this. So we have the small ones, which are roughly 1,000 years old. The large ones, which at least one of is about 2,000 years old, 1,800 to 2,000. Now, these large hands were dated at somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years old. And that raises a mind-boggling proposition that this cave may have been used as a repository for a tomb, if you will, or repository for bodies over a period of 5,000 years. I mean, what facility in the world, human culture, has been an ongoing enterprise for 5,000 years?
And for such weird creatures.
And they're so weird, and they're all related by the 3 fingers, and it goes on and on. We'll get.
I didn't know that they actually, some of them date back that long in history.
Yes.
That's extraordinary.
And weirdly, the DNA in these. We'll get to the DNA thing later. You know what? I just want to tie up my. I was saying that there were 3 possibilities.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One is that they are modern fakes. The other is that they are. I guess I did get to the end of that. The other is that they're authentic, unaltered beings. The other one is that they were put together.
Yeah, genetically engineered.
Well, no, that's another thing. Put together as, okay, first of all, we need to be very clear on the distinction between the different species of mummies. Very often in articles that you read in the tabloid press or in the mainstream press, they kind of lump them together as if there's just one species of mummies.
Oh, tell us.
These are incredibly distinct. I mean, these little ones are clearly reptilian because this little bump is where they found eggs inside. So that's reptilian by at least our classification system. The Maria type, the ones that are much more human, are mammals. Sorry,
with genitalia, with genitals, we can tell.
Interestingly, I believe all of them have been female.
Oh, really?
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Many of the ETs, like the little grays, they tend to be sort of neutral or neuter and without genitalia, but these specimens have genitalia.
Again, we have to be super careful about making the distinction between the small ones, the big ones, the hands, and this new species, which is hard to describe, almost like an insect kind of a creature, with also 3 fingers and 3 toes. And the reason I want to be clear about that is because when we talk about constructions, there is some evidence that the small beings, like the one I showed, could contain elements of other animals. This is a subtlety and a puzzle to many people. The skull of this creature it has some problems. And so it is possible that these are a different class of object than the large mummies. Maybe these are compositions put together as some kind of a ritual figure. That would be a huge archaeological mystery in itself. The reason why I entertain that idea, there are two. First of all, the eye sockets don't seem to be deep enough to contain an eyeball, a round eyeball, and there are eyeballs are universal right back to fish and lizards. The other thing is that the shape of the skull resembles remarkably the brain case of a small llama, a vicuña, or something in the camelid family, like a llama. Where the front of this head would be the rear of the llama skull. When I heard about this, I was up at a friend's house in the country, and she had a deer skull on her mantle, and I suddenly thought, whoa, yeah, the back of that deer skull does resemble the front of this. And then I found out that there was a study done, a peer-reviewed scientific paper, maybe the only one out on this topic, which discussed the resemblance of the skull to a llama skull, and they concluded that these skulls were probably constructed from a llama skull. Now, that, to many people, would throw this whole thing into great doubt, right? The whole story. If the head of these mummies is a modified llama skull stuck onto some kind of body, that would indicate that they are constructions. And again, that's where the distinction between modern fakes and ancient constructions becomes important. A modern fake is really not interesting to anyone. An ancient construction can be extraordinarily important, because why would they use it to think anything's never been found with that? And there's every evidence that these are ancient and made and put together at ancient time. Now, what could be an alternate theory that given they are not identical to a llama skull, but the resemblance is uncannily present. So, I've been dying for these things to be real from the moment I got into it. That's why it's fascinating. If they're fake, it doesn't interest me at all. So it troubled me that this resemblance, and that these people, and these were not scientists who were trying to debunk this. One of the scientists involved was Jose de la Cruz, who's been instrumental in this whole thing and is very supportive of the authenticity, the theory that they're authentic beings. And he was one of the 3 or 4 scientists who authored this paper. Now, significantly, there were parts of this skull, particularly the jaw, which is kind of a flap. It's like which one could argue were just added to the llama skull, but it's more complicated than that. It seems like the skull, the inherent bone structure, accommodates this flap, which certainly wouldn't be the case in a recycled llama skull. Do you follow?
Yeah. And it doesn't, if I understand from other conversations, the llama skull and the main body are completely seamless. In other words, it's not
that's another thing. So how could you possibly reconcile two things? I wouldn't be honest if I didn't tell you the things in this case that have made me say, but I went further with that, because there's so much evidence that these are not cobbled together from bones of animals. For example, the ribs, which you can see clearly in the CAT scans and the X-rays, are continuous arcs. They're annular. They're like a ring. They meet in the middle. Ours don't. Ours meet at the sternum, and then we have the free ribs, which don't meet at all, right? That are just hanging out there. And that's true of every animal. There is not a reptile, a fish, anything with ribs, including dinosaurs and their precursors, that had ribs that meet in the middle. So from what animal would they derive these ribs? What kind of pelvis is that? It's not a human pelvis. It's not a pelvis that's been immediately identified by anybody else. So it's one mystery on top of the other. And the fact that the skull remarkably resembles a llama skull is a real puzzle. So I asked, I'll be a little cagey here. There is a scientist, very qualified in precisely the kind of research one needs to do, and with a team around him of other scientists who are have expertise, pertinent expertise. And we went down there in February and we saw some of these bodies. I went down again to help translate, and just because it's fascinating to me. And I can't tell you his name at the moment because he would like to publish some peer-reviewed papers before he announces his efforts. And that's understandable on many levels, especially since there's such a rage of discrediting, and and people have careers they have to watch after. But he's very brave, and he's just doing this the right way. I could even argue that some of the pronouncements by the Maussan team could be interpreted as premature. When you say these are this, these are that, without the peer-reviewed science, people are going to say, wait a minute, why would I take the gold standard in factuality in matter scientific is the peer-reviewed paper. And so that's what he wants to do. So, but I said to him, is it, and he has specifically expertise in genetics and proteomics, which is the study of proteins. I said, is it just possible that if a agency of some kind, an entity, wanted to create bodies for whatever reason, is it possible that they would look around and say, hey, there's the llama that has a brain case about the same size and shape as what we could use. Let's take that DNA sequence for this that codes for the skull, manipulate it in whatever way we want, rather than starting from scratch. It sounds like a wacky theory, but he said it's not entirely wacky. That's possible. I mean, if you can imagine us trying to make a dog with a duck head, or a duck with a dog head, like in the movie Poor Things, how would you do that? You'd take a sequence that codes for the dog's head and somehow put it into the genome of the duck body so that it would express as a dog head on a duck. And that's one possibility that, again, doesn't really comport with current technology, and may not be a valid theory to many. But that's one way to square the idea that the skull looks remarkably like a llama skull, and yet it seems to be organically attached with nerves and blood vessels and sinew and all sorts of stuff to the rest of the body.
Well,
So
if you think about the centaur,
exactly,
the body of a horse, the
or a
torso
mermaid.
head of a man, or the various composite mermaids. History and mythology are replete with composite beings that are organically one organism.
Right. Not to argue that centaurs or mermaids are real, although they may have been. But yeah, this is that class of that's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that's one way to reconcile those two facts, that there's no indication of alteration, and yet the skull looks remarkably like the llama skull. I'm still concerned about the eye sockets. How do you fit an eyeball in there? And do the eyes protrude? They don't seem to have. We'll see. We'll see what happens. And the reason I keep wanting to stress that there are different species is because there is no such problem with the large ones. The large Maria type, which are humanoid. I mean, to describe them, like I said, they look. If you saw one walking down the street, you'd think it was a very strange-looking human, but you would not think it was an alien necessarily. But here are some of the things. Besides the three fingers, well, yes, if you saw their fingers and toes, you would. Besides their three fingers and toes, their heads, their skulls are actually 20% larger than ours. typical human being, or even the largest human head. Now, some people have argued that, well, many cultures have changed the shape of the skull by using boards. When a child is very young, they can shape the skull to make it longer, or they did that in Egypt, apparently, and even in South America. But that does not change the volume of the skull cavity, of the brain cavity. And these have a brain cavity that's 20% larger than ours. So that's not something you can do with manipulation. Also, the shape of these skulls doesn't look like they were forced into a particular shape. They look totally organic. The eyes are 20% larger, the eye sockets, and therefore the eyeballs must have been 20% larger than ours. Maria, weirdly enough, has 2 rows of teeth, like a shark. They look like human teeth, but now infants sometimes, I believe, have 2 rows of teeth. They have the adult teeth might be coming in, displacing the baby teeth, and maybe at some point they have 2 sets of teeth. But these are 2 fully expressed adult sets of teeth. Maria seems to have died in her 30s or late 20s. So that's totally anomalous as well. There's something very strange. The bones are much more substantial than ours. Now I'm going to get into the DNA for a second. But pardon me, I'm a fairly free-form thinker, and I tend to just I don't have much structure to this presentation. But
that's what makes you a good musician.
I guess so. One thing to the other. In terms of the DNA, tests have been done, and the results have been remarkable. What the test showed on Maria, for example, again, the humanoid type, I believe she's the only one that DNA tests have been done on so far of these large ones. She was the only one we knew about until very recently, when about 5 more were revealed by Jaime Maussan in that press conference. But the DNA from Maria, my understanding, and what came out of the DNA labs, is that she has 5% chimpanzee DNA that is specific to a chimpanzee, 5% DNA that is specific to a bonobo, which is a variant of a chimpanzee, but famously much less aggressive and very sexual and friendly kind of a great ape. And then some percentage of human DNA, 20 or 40%, and then a bunch of unknown DNA that they couldn't. The unknown is problematic because there are contaminations, but generally the contaminant would be something that we know of, that we can say this is a bacteria or this is a fungus or whatever it is. But apparently there was a lot of unknown DNA. That could be the DNA that was introduced from the creator race, if you will. And that would make these things hybrids. I think it's pretty clear that they are hybrids. They are certainly not only hybrids of human and something else, but hybrids of the something else, humans, apparently chimpanzees and bonobos. And the human DNA, according to what I understand and was published, is from a man, or not a man, a human being from the Philippines, which is about as far away from which is about as far away from Peru as you can get. Now, to me, that sounds like somebody was going around with an Easter basket, picking up DNA from around the world, from Africa, from the Philippines, and from God knows where, and somehow mixing them because they wanted a certain result, which, whether or not it worked out, turned out to be Maria and the ones that are like her. Now I'm going to skip way ahead, and then I'd love you to ask me some questions to fill in all the gaps that I left out. This last batch of mummies that Jaime announced, not in his last conference, but the one before that, the one where there was sound problems, they're very significant. They are, I think, 4 or 5 more mummies and a few heads of those large creatures like Maria. And the most fantastic news of all that everybody should take note of is that one of these mummies, they were all CT scanned, and one of them turned out to be pregnant. I guess you're aware of that. Do you know that? And inside her abdomen was the equivalent of a 4-month gestated fetus. Now, who knows if they had the same reproductive cycle, a gestational period as humans, but assuming they did, this was the equivalent of a 4-month fetus in her abdomen, apparently with the remains of the amniotic sac around it. And you're talking about a being maybe that big, and you can imagine how tiny, how minute and delicate the bones are of a thing like that. And the bones weren't even articulated. That is, they weren't joined completely together if you look at the CAT scans, because obviously there was some disassociation but they're all there. Every single bone of that little tiny fetus is in the abdomen of the one they call Montserrat. Now, to me, and most importantly, that little fetus had 3 fingers and 3 toes on each hand and foot. So that's a level of complexity and surgical prowess to assemble a disarticulated fetus inside the body of another being.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
And we're talking about bones and tissue that has been dried up, desiccated for thousands of years, or at least nearly 2,000 years. It just, not only does it say that it's not a modern construction, it says that to me, that it's authentic. Now, if Maria and that class of mummies is authentic, then it's harder to imagine that the small ones are not authentic. But it's possible that it's a mix. It's possible that but my overall theory, not that it's worth a thing, but I've discussed this with Terry and the professor that I deal with, and we tend to agree that this was some kind of a genetic experimental enterprise that went on for millennia. And
amazing.
And for some reason, the progenitors of these creatures preferred 3 fingers and 3 toes. And that seemed to be all they really cared about in terms of uniformity. I mean, they were making things that looked like reptiles with 3 fingers and 3 toes, and things that looked like mammals, and things that looked something like insects. There's a creature about this big, about 10, 12 inches long, and I saw it in person. There is a couple of these around. They're certainly the same species. They are extremely strange looking, and I wish I could present you with a photograph. I just don't technically know quite how to do it. I could put a photo on the screen, but what I recommend is that people go and take notes, please, to Cherry Jamin's website. He has done an amazing job of documenting these discoveries. And that website is www.the-alien-project.com.
I have a couple photos, Will, that I could show that
Please.
just give people a sense, and you can comment.
Sure.
Let me just bring it up here. Can people see that?
Okay. Oh, yeah. And this brings up a whole bunch of other things. First of all, those things that look like eggs are eggs. What kind of eggs they are, we do not know. This is a small mummy. In fact, this is exactly the same mummy that I showed you the model of. They call it Josephina, female, and that's another son. Now, that is
that's little Charlie.
Oh, hi, Charlie. Now, go back to the first one, please, the X-ray. Okay, so those 3 objects are eggs. There's actually a much smaller egg, which seemed to be in development. Now, this is larger. Well, on my screen, it's larger than actual size. The whole being is about 2.5 feet tall. So those eggs are jelly bean size, if you will. But the little egg that seems to be in formation is a couple of millimeters in length. And again,
Wow.
you know, to think of putting that in a body to fool who, the whole idea that someone who's trying to sell something or pull off a hoax is going to give it to a scientist in order to have it CAT scanned and carbon dated and DNA tested, just
Yeah.
completely counterintuitive. If they want to fool people, they're going to do everything they can to keep it out of the hands
Exactly.
like that. Now, if you move on to the next slide. Okay, this
Whoops.
no, not that one. That's Charlie. That one there. That very conspicuous bow tie or dumbbell-shaped white thing in the middle there. By the way, this is a CT scan with artificial coloring, meaning that softer tissue is given one, I think it's by density, one color, and other tissue is given. So the bones you can see are clearly white. I think the red represents connective tissue, which would exactly what you would expect to be on the ends of the bones, connecting the bones one to another. Now that white thing in the middle is extremely mysterious. It's made of metal, and the metal that it's made of is an ancient alloy. It corresponds to the alloy, an alloy that the Incas were using at about this time, which is, and you can't tell from the picture because again, it's false color, but it's actually gold, silver, and copper mixed. But there's something extremely interesting and intriguing about this metal. In the metal, apparently you can't see with the CT scan, but with the X-ray, you can see that there are points in this metal that are super dense. What an X-ray does is basically it determines density. That's why bones stand out from flesh, etc. But when you're looking at metal, you can see denser metals and less dense metals. Lead will stop most of an X-ray, which is why you wear a lead apron at an X-ray. But there was something denser than lead, much denser than lead, twice as dense as lead in this metal. And the only thing that exists in the world, the only element that is twice as heavy as lead, is an element called osmium, O-S-M-I-U-M. The chemical letter, the element letter is OS. It's an element that most people have never heard of. It was only discovered by Western science in the 1800s, and it's used. It's extremely hard to isolate. It's extremely hard to find, incredibly rare. It's usually found in platinum mines as a kind of a byproduct or it exists in that environment of platinum. But from the density, there appeared to be fairly large amounts of osmium in that plate. And that just boggles the mind. If this is a modern fake, why would in the world would anybody pay hundreds of dollars for pieces of osmium to stick into a metal plate on the body? If it's an ancient one, where the hell did they get it?
Get it.
And if they're real, what in the world was this for? I think in modern technology, osmium is used in communications and computers, but I don't know exactly what its function is.
What about this one? Whoops.
Okay, well, that looks like, to me, that looks like a slice of the CT scan that's beyond the metal. So it's now you're looking deeper into the body, and it's showing, I guess, the spinal cord and the cross sections of a bunch of bones, like the cross section of the arm bones. Now, I also understand that the arm bones on these small creatures are hollow, and hollow bones are really only found in birds and some dinosaurs, where they needed extremely light weight to fly or move in the way they do. So you don't find hollow bones in reptiles, modern reptiles. You certainly don't find hollow bones in mammals. So where did these bones come from? There's another puzzle.
Yeah.
Any more?
No, that should do it.
Okay.
Wow, Will, this has been an incredible illumination and a scintillation of the senses and our capacity to imagine how weird and wonderful the human past actually is.
Right. And it seems obvious or evident that these creatures did interact with humans. I mean, the fact that they shared an alloy,
Yeah.
maybe who knows what their limitations were? Who knows? They could do this, but they couldn't do that. Maybe they didn't have the technology to make metals or to make alloys, but they had the technology through some agency we can't even imagine of manipulating genetics.
Exactly.
I think this is going to be something, it's so much stranger in a sense than the UFO phenomenon. As strange as that is, from a certain point of view, certainly there are countless, endless facets of the UFO phenomenon. And I want to add, there's no direct correlation between these and UFOs.
Yeah, very good point.
There is some anecdotal stuff that some of the people who have seen these have seen UFOs in many UFOs. Nazca is full of them. So that makes a connection. But these beings.
Well, there's the whole, I mean, Nazca, Peru is
Yes.
that one place where if you look at the landscape from, a couple miles up in an airplane, you see that it's hundreds of miles of symbols and
yes,
looks like runways and geometric shapes and
yes,
so forth that couldn't have possibly been done by little people on the ground who couldn't look more than 6 feet up. So, I mean, Nazca, Peru is in terms of many ancient
mysteries,
archaeologists, a site of potential heavy ET traffic.
yeah. The lines of Nazca, that's a debatable thing. It's certainly a huge mystery, and it seems to it seems to imply that at least these drawings were made for the benefit of people who were up in the air, right? Because you can't see them from the ground. But even putting that aside, what I was saying about these certainly do not look like creatures that walked off a shiny new UFO. You know what I'm saying? The little grays that we see impeccably dressed in their little uniforms, and you don't see them limping around or having their arm.
It seems clearly to be an experiment, some kind of
and in fact, one
intentional engineering feat.
Right. So I would say this is, if it's related to the UFO, these are not the occupants of the UFOs. These are a byproduct, let's say, an experiment done perhaps with people.
Good point.
So just want to say, not on Josephina, but I want to make it clear that these metal implants, if you want to call them that, or metal accoutrements that these things are wearing, they are not in general structural. They're not holding the thing together. Someone might say, oh yeah, they put them there so they don't fall apart. That's clearly not what they do. The one on Josephina, for example, is on the outside of her chest. It's not holding anything together. So its function was something other than that. And there are many, many of these metal plates. I looked at a skull, I think that has not really been shown, but it's typical, which had 7 plates on, just on the skull alone, like one here, one in the back of the head, one under the jaw. So what those plates were, but clearly they were not used for structural. I just wanted to say, though, about the fact that these beings were not in good shape. They have been shown to have suffered some kind of osteoarthritis. Some while they were alive, the bones had gone through some osteoporosis, for example. So one would think if you're an alien in your own spaceship, you can cure that kind of thing. So that's another reason to think that these maybe were an experiment, which is not to say that they didn't roam through the world. Can I tell you, do we have a moment or are we done?
Yeah, we're getting close to the end, but Take a moment. Absolutely.
I will tell you just an interesting story. Do with it what you like. I was at the Contact in the Desert last June or May, whatever it was, and fascinating. It was a wonderful experience. And I met a woman there. She was with a small group of people who claimed to communicate with UFOs and with their occupants. And I said, they were kind of on their own, and I spoke to them. An unusual looking group. They had a kind of uniform on, but very nice people. And I spoke to the woman who seemed to be in charge, and we talked for a while. I said, you communicate with aliens telepathically or in dreams? No, they come and we talk to them like I'm talking to you. That's intriguing. And of course, I'm thinking, is this true or not? Because that's natural. And I said, hey, I'd like to show you something. So I reached in my suitcase and I took out this body. I said, does that ring any bells? And she goes, oh, I know them. I said, what? You know them? Oh, yeah. And then all her colleagues, about 4 or 5 of them, are going, yeah, we know them. Like, you've talked to them? Oh, yes, yeah, we've talked to them. She said, they're called the Montauk's. I said, the Montauk's, like the Indians? She said, yeah, the Indians got their name from these creatures. And she said they exist in cave systems all the way from Tierra del Fuego up to Nova Scotia on the east coast of the United States, and they live subterranean. And she went on with a list of things about. I said, well, how do they eat with their, with having with only a kind of a flap for a jaw? They said, oh, they absorb nutrients through their hands. I mean, for every question, she wasn't like thinking, oh yeah, let's see, she wasn't.
Remarkable.
Again, I say, take this for what it's worth.
Yeah.
This woman seemed very, very sincere and credible to me, and her colleagues were all just sort of nodding like it was all common knowledge. So it is possible that they created these races for whatever reason, and these races then populated the world.
Well, that great line that not only is the universe more mysterious than you imagine, it's more mysterious than you can imagine.
Exactly what comes to mind.
You put this together, Will, with Göbekli Tepe, which is like 10,000 years more ancient than the pyramids in Egypt and other extraordinary phenomena. How we hold on to our current very conventional theory of evolution is getting more and more tenuous.
Right. We have a paradigm that's invisible to us. We just were born
exactly
in it, like a fish in water, and we can't imagine what's happening in outer space if we're a fish, right? Yeah. And I'm hoping that when the papers come out verifying that these things are authentic beings, that it will be accepted with a kind of openness and a humility that science has not shown in the past, saying this is, a revelation on the scope of the Earth goes around the sun instead of the sun goes around the Earth. Yeah. Maybe even more so, because this blows everything away.
That's one reason why I've been so personally fascinated and institutionally with the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity, because I think what you're saying is really true. If this is true, if the Nazca mummies are authentic, it's one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time, because it's going to blow away every assumption we've ever made in our arrogant modernity about the way it was.
Archaeological, biological, philosophical, physics, chemistry,
genetics.
Exactly.
And it's surfacing right at the moment when we're starting to get disclosure by the U.S. government that we're being told by the Kogi that we're in our final reckoning, that there's genocide in Gaza and the Nazca bodies in Peru. How we humans hold the complexio oppositorum, as Jung would say, as one phenomenon that we're called upon to expand our consciousness broadly enough to understand is really the epistemological challenge of our time.
Yeah.
If we can hold it all, we can hold it all. And if we can't, we'll lose it all.
And wouldn't it be wonderful if that kind of sudden uncertainty and sudden confusion that this is going to generate somehow makes us more humble with each other and with ourselves?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and is it possible? I'm going to leave you with this, okay?
Sure.
It has been, one wonders why in all the thousands of years or the hundreds of years of tomb plundering in Peru, no one has ever come across these bodies before. Is it possible that whoever is responsible for these things wants us to discover these things now? And is it
Yes.
possible that with all the nonsense and arrow bullshit and narrow, of the Pentagon and all that, and trying to just, we all know that the UFOs exist, but we just can't get our fingers around it. Maybe the aliens or some group of them has said, you know what, flying saucers that can, outpace any airplane we have,
Exactly.
kind of scary. What if we just give them something to chew on, like milk food, like a baby food, and that would be some dead aliens that can't hurt them, and then they'll get used to the idea they can put that.
That's the $64,000 point, ladies and gentlemen. Will Gallison, thank you so much. I hope you can come into our after chat for a few minutes, just because there's a number of people that I think would like to interact with you. If you could put the link in the chat box, Stan or whoever, that would be great. There. So if you see the link in the chat, Will, if you click on that link, you'll go to the after chat, and there'll be a bunch of people that are just dying to talk with you.
My goodness, lots of people, 99 plus.
Okay, everyone. That'll do it for us for today. We'll be visiting the Nazca bodies again. Tomorrow, we're going to stay in South America and look at the UAP disclosure movement around Latin America with Ricardo Ortiz. And that'll bring us to a close. You'll see the link in the chat box for the after chat if you want to join Will. And we'll see you all again here tomorrow. Bye for now. Thanks, Will.
Thank you so much.